Although the pandemic's been dealt with, in a way, countries still continue to face major political conflicts and civilian disagreement festers. This list gives the names of the 10 most dangerous countries in the world, all as a result of the relentless violence and abuse of power. So let's get right into it. Sitting at number 10 is Russia. Not gonna lie, but Russia is definitely at the top of our go-to countries. Imagine walking around St. Petersburg, relishing in the rich, revolutionary history of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, it seems that Putin has other plans. The decades-long conflict between Ukraine and Russia has finally spilled over into the international area as Russia took to invading Ukraine earlier this year. I don't know if you heard about that. It was kind of on the news a little bit. Perhaps one of the leading political events of this year, it's created a drastic divide between the global powers, especially the NATO and non-NATO allies. Russia's invasion has stirred up major concerns as terrifying stories of war on both sides of the border keep increasing with each passing day. The civilians are equally involved in holding strikes and civilian protests amidst the totalizing reign of Putin, who's become blindsided by international relations as camps of the Russian army continue to proliferate in Ukraine. In this situation, would you want to be caught up in the 21st century rendition of Nazi Germany? Especially in Russia, where tolerance and multicultural diversity are being impeached under the name of a horrifying nationalism. Maybe let's wait till Putin finally deals with his ego and calms down just a wee bit before you think about making a trip to Russia this year. Lenin's preserved body can wait a couple of months for you. Next is the Central African Republic. Continuing with the intensity of political conflicts, the Central African Republic, it isn't doing too well either. Despite its rich cultures and its dense colonial history, the fate of this African country has continued to be riddled with poverty and violence. In the last year, 37% of the country's GDP was spent in the reparation costs of the widespread violence between civilians and authorities. The conflict between two presidential candidates, Touadéra and Bozizé, led to the formation of guerrilla warfare and rebellious factions that created chaos and violence, which led to a heartbreaking increase in the high number of refugees who were forced to seek asylum in other countries of the African Union. The country burned under civilian protest as homes were ransacked by terrorist organizations, and the lives of women and children seemed disposable. Traveling to a country whose civilians are running away from the unpredictability of the state ain't the smartest idea. So let's reroute back to this country once the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs completes its mission and actually establishes peace there. Up next, we've got Libya. If we were to do like a quicksy little Google search for a travel itinerary to Libya, the first result that you would see is do not travel to Libya because of COVID, crime, terrorism, civil unrest, kidnapping, and armed conflict. I mean, seriously, is there any kind of political violence or threat that's not prevalent in Libya since the 15-month-long armed conflict in June of 2020? Amidst the peak of political tension and civil unrest, many civilians were tragically displaced, both internationally and nationally. But surviving political unrest wasn't enough, as Libya was one of those nations that was also drastically impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. While civilians tried to save themselves from political violence, the pandemic gave way and millions of people have lost their lives in the past 2 years as a result of both of these issues striking down on Libyan people. But the pandemic in no way deterred the civilian strikes, as more people took to the streets to speak up against the state's failure. Categorized as one of the most politically volatile nations, Libya still requires help from the global platform for its political and medical emergencies amidst its continuing decay of its people and culture in the wake of unsolicited and ongoing terror. Now at number 7 is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Although home to one of the most vibrant cultures in world history, the DRC has had severe ongoing problems, which have made it rather hostile and unsafe for visitors. In recent years, the political unrest in Congo has been fueled by its war with Zambia, who they share a border with. Reports of violence have piled sky high, both as a result of the war with Zambia, but also just because of general civilian unrest due to the rapid increase in poverty as the DRC's government continues to unabashedly invest in ammunition for the war. While we know the DRC is home to a rich indigenous culture, let's hope that the violence and destitution doesn't completely wipe it out, as peace and prosperity might soon be regained. So let's cross our fingers and dot our toes, you know? Up next, Somalia. Somalia is a commonly known name when one talks about the most destitute nations of the world. Also a part of the African Union, Somalia has been ripe with poverty and famine for decades. Before the Syrian conflict, Somalia was one of the leading places where relief packages were sent. In most cases, poverty was directly linked to political unrest. The case for Somalis is very much the same. The increasing role of terror groups, the Al-Shabaab, continue to terrorize not only its people, but there have been increasingly more attacks on airports and other points of entry. These conflicts continue to push Somalia into greater poverty. In recent years, the situation has unfortunately not improved at all. But years of destitution and misery have also opened the way for violence and exploitation. It's not safe for citizens, so how safe could it be for a foreigner? Sitting at number 5 is Iraq. The ripples of the 2003 invasion of Iraq still resonate to this day. Iraq is home to the rich culture of the Shia sect in Islam and is quite famous as a tourist spot for many Muslims who travel from all over the world to pay homage to this history. However, the country today is still under the control of one of the most authoritarian regimes. The public is still living in constant fear of the militia and security forces as forced disappearances of common civilians continue to surge in recent times. Against the forces of authority, the civilians are existing at the mercy of the authority, who wants to ensure that the censorship and public mobilization are strictly curtailed, even today. The impunity of the government is a serious threat not only to the freedom of its people, but also establishes the country under a form of martial law. It'll be safe to travel to Iraq once the country is successful in establishing democracy, but until then, Iraq remains to be a state where civilians exist in fear of it. Next up, we got South Sudan. One of the youngest nations, South Sudan gained its independence from Sudan in 2011. Although it's been an independent state for 11 years now, South Sudan continues to be tangled up in some geopolitical conflicts with Sudan. Constant issues revolving around national security plague the new state as it struggles to keep up its independence. These impacts keep becoming more and more prominent as cases of violence continue to rise drastically, especially cases of sexual abuse against civilians. Violence has thus forced mass migrations of the South Sudan population, with no hopes of simmering down the violent and unstable nature of this new country. Now at number 3, Syria. Syria's gained a dangerous reputation because of its repeated invasions and strikes that the country has faced since it became independent in 1945. Syria has had invasions from multiple fundamentalist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, among others. The most devastating impact has absolutely been the Israeli invasions, and the most recent one being in 2021, with the bombings in the Gaza Strip and over different regions in Syria. The civilians are not only grappled with the invasions as they were bombarded repeatedly, but they also had to deal with COVID-19 on top of all this, a pandemic that Syria did not have the financial and the medical funding to deal with. Syrians have been left with no choice. They have to migrate to other places, the most common of which being Lebanon, Greece, and Europe. In the last few years, the migrations rounded off to 4.5 million. As refugees boarded boats, they're carried away on the Mediterranean Sea, away from a landscape covered in rubble, dust, and remnants of a lost homeland. Next up is Yemen. A Persian Gulf nation, Yemen has become the site of conflict between Saudi and Iranian political groups, as both struggle for power over this country. Amidst the relentless political disorganization, the country is ripe with violence and civilians continuing to seek asylum and refugee in other countries. As Yemen has failed in doing so in the past couple of years, a recent poll has showed that more than 51% of its population did not feel safe in Yemen because of the unpredictability of the state and the ongoing unchallenged spectrum of violence that's enacted on its helpless citizens. And sitting at number 1 is Afghanistan. Afghanistan has remained at the top of this list with high levels of violence since the last decade. The main reason for all of this is because of the repeated multiple invasions at the start of the century, plus the country's reputation for being home to multiple Taliban factions. The recent spike in Afghanistan's situation has been the evacuation of U.S. military troops there in 2021. This move led to the power of the state going directly to the Taliban, who have had a massive influence on not just the politics, but the day-to-day life of its citizens. As the civilians remain under the weight of these oppressive forces, the Taliban have taken away the possibility of a democratic utopia by having troops stationed in all of the major parts of the city, establishing themselves as a draconian authority. Under the control of the Taliban, the rate of violence, protests, and censorship has increased a lot, too much. Life in Afghanistan will continue to be a nightmare unless a democratic and fair political system is established in a country that hasn't seen peace and prosperity for a long time. And that's a wrap for today's video. So I'll see you in the next one.